Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth in a series of 5 series with, let's face it, uncomfortable race conversations. I'm hosting on behalf of Sydney today, so hopefully I'll do my best to bridge this as well as she does. We're really excited for this panel. We've got a bunch of new faces that we're going to hear from. I know that one of our panelists is having a little bit of technical difficulties, but will be joining as soon as she's able. So we'll hear from her separately. Vanessa Janik is going to be joining us. As Sydney likes to talk about, the rules of engagement here are very simple. This is to bring people together through respectful conversations to help understand other points of view. We're not here to try to change anyone's opinion. It's really just an exercise in how to have really difficult conversations about very sensitive and passionate topics. Through the lens of respecting another individual and understanding those experiences that led them to those beliefs. So as always, we have the wonderful James Hadlock that's going to be moderating for us today. I'll let him introduce our panelists here in a moment as we hear their stories, but encourage everyone to use the chat and the Q&A as we typically do. We'll spend a few minutes kind of off camera after the top of the hour to engage our panelists in some of your questions to make sure that we have time to get to those and have some really stimulating dialogue. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to James and go ahead and get us started. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. And as always, we are so grateful that you've decided to be with us during this time. We know your time is precious, but we're going to dive right in. We're going to be talking about uncomfortable conversations about race. And I want to first introduce our panelists and let them share a little bit about why they decided to be a part of this conversation today. And let's go ahead and start with you, Ken. Maybe just share a little bit of your background and then why you decided to be a part of the panel.
Well, it was a great invitation, and I was happy to accept, just because this is the whole issue of racial equity, particularly racial equity in policing, is something that I've been focused on for perhaps the last 35 years of my nearly 40-year career in public safety. And when the opportunity arose here today to participate, I had a very interesting experience with one of my employees, one of my black employees. We sat down, we'd been friends for many, many years, and I said, hey, I've been invited to participate in this discussion, and you and I have known each other very well for a long time. We've been good friends. Never once have we talked about race, and can we have a conversation about what it feels like to be a black police officer in Utah, a black police officer in an organization where we are about 85% white, and in a community where we're about 85% white. And I won't share the entire content. I'm just going to short circuit to the result of that conversation. We came away with some profound understanding that we'd never experienced before, and a new profundity in our relationship and friendship that I found to be incredibly rewarding. And for me, that's just a metaphor of where I think that we can go with these uncomfortable conversations. I think that we can build bridges that are powerful. I think that we can build relationships that are rewarding and resilient. And my hope is, candidly, I think I'm the oldest participant here, that when my grandkids are at the point we're at, they will look at these kind of conversations as weird discussions that their grandparents had in the old world. That's my hope.
I love that vision, Ken, and thank you so much for participating. Laura, let's go ahead and turn it over to you.
So when one of my best friends asked that I would join this panel last minute, I accepted without even really taking a long thought about it. I'm new to Utah, and I came here with the goal to really try to help with diversity and inclusivity. I didn't know that there was such an issue in Utah with race. It was the first time in my career and really just in life where it had been pointed out that I wasn't white. And that was really odd to me that it had come up so many times. I just felt like with the way the climate is in our social the way it is just socially, that it was just time for me to step up and speak out a little bit more. The thing I like to do is coach young professionals and to be active listeners and to not have knee-jerk reactions when they come across situations like we have had recently in the news and just in society. And so I really want to take this time today to see what my cohorts here on the panel have to say, and you know, come together and have these uncomfortable conversations and see how we can work together and partner and move on.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you for being willing to be a part of this. Sean, my friend, thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to join the panel today.
I've been here in Utah for about 40 years now, after coming from Southern California, but I grew up in the 60s and 70s as a young person, and actually was a part of the desegregation of our public school system in Riverside, California, which has been a huge impact in my life, even to this day. So one of the things that really brought me here was the opportunity again to share some of the burdens and some of the considerations that people have to have in our society as to what's impacting people from all of our communities and how we can better come together. So I really feel like my biggest task and honor is to be a bridge builder in our community. And I was asked by Sydney to join this conversation. And I just feel honored just to be here and be a part of this dialogue with all of you.
Well, thank you. And Sean, I know you are, you're someone that I know. I want you to also share just a little bit about one of your roles here in the state of Utah, just to give people a little bit more of that background as it relates to education.
Okay. Yeah, I serve on the State Board of Education, which is a real fun position to be in right now. I also serve, just recently was appointed to the State Board of Higher Education. So education is really important to me, especially since I grew up as a kid that was not great in school, both on the social side and the academic side, but that had to do the extra work to build my capacities and capabilities, and just trying to navigate education, the education system. So that's my biggest role here in the state, and then also working with a number of our civic groups at the same time to try to make sure that we connect the social aspects of education as well as the academic necessities for people in need.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And thank you for your service, for everything that you do in our community, and really for all three of you. Now, I want to just mention we have Vanessa that we're hopeful will still be able to join us today. We're having a few difficulties there. But if she does come on, we will take a moment to make sure that she has an opportunity to introduce herself and share a little bit more. But we're not going to wait. We're going to go ahead and move forward. And I would love to ask some questions and maybe share or ask you, Ken, because I know it's something that I think I'm not the only one that's interested in, but I'd love to know, because of your service in law enforcement for the last, I think you said 40 years or so, can you share a little bit about how you talk about racism in your organization? Because in our world today, I think there's some assumptions, and I'd love to hear directly from you what your thoughts are and what you're doing to address race within the police department and within law enforcement.
Thank you. First, let me say that the conversation and the framework of the conversation is shifting, and I'm very grateful for that, because for so many years in government, I think generally, but I can speak specifically to policing, we have looked at topics of racial equity through the lens of attorneys and statutes and EEOC dictates. I happen to be an attorney as well. Obviously, I don't practice law, and I see a wonderful transition in that we can have more honest and more open conversations internally in our organization about how we police with equity in the community, what that means. I think a year ago, for example, many police officers, and still today some, when they would hear Black Lives Matter, there would be a very quick rejoinder, hey, all lives matter, or blue lives matter. And so what was happening, I think, is that some folks weren't stepping back to say, well, what does that mean when you say Black Lives Matter? How does that impact the conversation? And I think that we're having more conversations now about what it means to speak out and say Black Lives Matter. What am I hearing as a 60 plus and then some white police officer when I hear that? So I think the conversation is changing, and for me and for our police department here in West Jordan, it is changing, has changed to a place that we can have the discussions that topic of today that are uncomfortable, and yet we know because of mutual respect, mutual affection, and even love, they'll have a good outcome. Now, what are we doing in our agency? Well, we're participating in a number of initiatives, some of them new, frankly, but some of them pretty long-standing. For example, we have a program in our agency where we train all of our officers in a course known as Developing and Implementing an Outward Mindset. It's an Arbinger Institute product. We don't really think that we get a lot of success in teaching officers, you must behave in this particular way, and when you're dealing with a particular individual, you've got to do X, Y, and Z. We are focusing on training our officers to think in terms that you matter like I matter, that everyone has value, and we are seeking the interests of the people that we serve in policing. And I know that if there's any cops online, they're thinking, yeah, there he goes again. It is a little bit pie in the sky, but it's achievable and it's doable. We also are engaged in a wonderful program with some local business leaders called First Step to Trust, where we bring together educators and police officers, young people of color, in structured conversations over lunch talking about our shared experiences. I'm a huge believer that we don't learn by statute, we don't learn by course, we learn by feelings, and we learn by hearing one another's stories. And so we're providing a number of intentional opportunities for officers in our department to hear stories of people of color in our community, and we're starting to see some pretty good results.
Yeah, maybe you can. Well, let me go to Laura and Sean, because I would love to know your perspective about what Ken has shared, and if you'd like to even dig a little bit deeper into what he just talked about. Either of you want to start?
I think it's a start, what Ken is saying. It's impressive to hear that that there's some sort of program to adjust the way the officers or how they're going about things. I'd like to see, are there any metrics that are being measured to see how successful? Is there is there a time period that you're measuring it from? So you see the level of success that you're, the numbers that you're trying to I don't know, goals that you can see that the level of success, like when you're starting a certain program.
Yes, let me respond to that. There's a couple of, these are the sort of hard things that are very hard to measure, but there are some metrics we're looking at. First, just in terms of personal context, the number of conversations that we can have, we're tracking that. I don't know how helpful that is, but we certainly are tracking it. And working with our city's community engagement director on an instrument that will measure satisfaction by local citizens in policing. I think for me, though, that the most important metric is when I have an officer sit down and say, Chief, I never had this thought. I never had the understanding that I have today because of the conversation we participated in. I'll just give you an example, Laura. As we chatted yesterday, you and I heard some of your experiences coming to Utah. I had an emotive response, thinking, oh my gosh, if that happened in my community, I wish that I had known. I wish that I'd been able to to speak out and intervene. So metrics, yes, but the big measure of success for us, I think, will be to hear the stories from our officers about their successes interacting with persons of color, and not just persons of color, but persons of all sexual preferences, religions, ethnicities, creeds in our community. And if anyone has any thoughts about metrics that would be helpful, I'm very, very receptive and would love to hear about that. Sean, you have a track record, I know, in industry, but also in the educational community, and you might have some ideas.
Yeah, I think it's, you mentioned pie in the sky, and I think that's what we're all reaching for here. It's difficult to measure impacts on your DNA as an entity. And I think that's what we look for is opportunities for your employees or your officers to be able to come to you and express their shifts in their mindsets. What we're looking at here in systems that you're working on, for example, is creating a cultural shift, a shift where officers are becoming more ingrained in understanding how their communities react to the way that they behave, and finding positive outcomes out of that. It's going to take a lot of dialogue. It's just going to take you continuing to share with these folks, because not everything can be put on paper and be tracked, but you can actually start to see shifts in the way that people are accepting and accepting of the way that they're treated. I think the programs that you're also instilling into your department need to be shared. They need to be shared with the community to show that you're working on progress. None of us are perfect, so we're all, we're like clay. We're all being formed every single day. As long as we keep adding that moisture and adding that ability to stay pliable, and it's really critical that you share some of these things that you're working on, so that people understand that it's not going to be perfect. Nothing's ever perfect ever, but as long as you're doing the work, people can accept that. And I think that it's critical that your officers also accept that they're doing the work and your department's doing the work together. There is no instant cure for any of the things that ail us in our society, but dialogue and authentic curiosity will create environments where we can continue to grow.
But can I ask, though, with how hostile things have been, especially with the protests, do you think it's enough? Do you think what you're doing is enough to really change the minds of how people are viewing officers, which I think is sad, really? People have a lot of distrust in officers right now when it comes to racism.
Well, it won't be enough, Laura, until my young grandkids, who we've been cops in my family for 151 years this year, and there's another generation coming after me. When my grandkids who are cops come to me and say, wow, that was weird, that you had these issues, then I will look back and say, yeah, I think we did enough. So I'm not content, even if for a moment other people think we're doing enough. I'm not content. It's a challenge, because officers are facing incredible hostility. And I've had a number of officers who had their cars at home spray painted, brick thrown at one of my officers, rocks thrown through their windows. A neighbor approached one of my officers' neighbors, and said, would you mind parking your police car around the back of the house? When I grew up, everybody wanted to have a police officer living down the street. And I was really shocked that in my community, a neighbor would ask my officer to hide the fact that she was a police officer. And that hostility is it's a challenge for us internally, but we're doing our best to address it. And if I can follow up on your metric question, something has come to mind. This isn't directly related to the metrics of the conversation we're having today, but we've seen in our police department over the last 3 years a very significant decline in our uses of force. And we attribute that to a couple of things. We attribute to the fact that we measure force, that we have a very aggressive and robust reporting and review system, but also because we are training our officers to better engage, to better use their minds and their mouths. And as we have more discussion about equity in policing and de-escalation, we anticipate that we'll see numbers of force incidents decline as well. Now, is that a direct metric to what we're talking about today? No, it's an indirect metric. Nonetheless, it's a pretty profound impact on the community.
So Ken, so one of the things that I've noticed that in our chat is how super important it is, from what Sean shared, about getting this message out there about the way that you're addressing this. Because I know that the media is going to report whatever the media is going to report, but are there some ways that you have thought about maybe getting this message out there in a more effective way?
Yes, there are a couple of ways. I was gratified that there's an article in the paper, I still haven't read it, about our police department pursuing a philosophy of peace. But the state legislator saw it and called up and said, look, can I come and meet with you and talk about some of the things that you're trying to do? I don't want to tout and say we've had profound successes, because we've had small successes, but we will someday. And Sean, I guess maybe what you're saying to me is you're encouraging me to get out and talk about what we're trying, even if we haven't yet succeeded in a grand way. Mm-hmm. And so I've had conversations this week with a state legislator about promoting, for example, the Street Smart de-escalation course that we use in our agency. I've been invited to participate in a task force called Listen, Learn, Love, that is co-sponsored by the Utah League of Cities and Towns, the Utah Municipal Attorneys Association, the Association of Counties, and a couple of other groups, where we will talk about what is working in delivering police services. And so that's a forum where we can share with others in our profession about what we think is working and listen to what they're doing. And I don't want to discount that there are some really wonderful things being done in other agencies, other departments. We're creeping ahead. We're doing our best to move ahead, but as Laura pointed out, we're moving ahead in a time of hostility, and that's challenging. But we're trying to be humble and we're trying to be teachable.
It is. You know, when I think about the sharing, I kind of call these progress reports, and if you can give a progress report to citizens, it's really helpful. I heard from about a police department yesterday that as part of their hiring process, all of their rookie officers were required to knock on the doors and introduce themselves to the citizens in the areas of which they were patrolling. And I thought, hey, that's a great idea. I know the cost and ability to have officers walking a beat now is really not something that's possible because of the vast amount of ground that they have to cover. But I think something that introduces officers to being able to understand the importance of engagement makes a world of difference. If we can get people to get over the adversarial mindset that they have with law enforcement, I think that they would be in the place where I am, where I value the law enforcement officers that provide protection for me and my family. But I think because I'm connected to law enforcement officers like yourself and others need to have that same connection, understanding that, it is important to know that we are all people just doing what we do. But we also have different responsibilities in our community that create these environments that we want to live in that are safe and conducive to our lives being as valuable and as great as they can possibly be. So I think one of the things, in addition to exposure, is connection. And without connection, we don't feel obligated to listen to others. We don't feel obligated to consider these to other people. But if we can find little ways to connect officers to the people within their communities they're serving, it just makes it so much harder for you to see or to blow up when something happens, because now you're willing to really take a look at things critically and say, wait a minute, we have to look at the entire situation and not just jump the gun, because I know Ken and I know how he and his guys perform their job. So I think looking for those type of mechanisms are really important. Again, those are hard to measure, but they're activities that you can actually expand upon continually.
Sean,
Yeah, and I want to just can we just break for 1 second, Laura, because we've got Vanessa in. Is that all right? I want to introduce Vanessa. We're excited to have you here with us. Vanessa, can you just introduce yourself and share a little bit of why you decided to be on this, and then we'll keep going with the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So I am a stay-at-home mom of two little ones. One is 2 years old and one is 5. I have been born and raised in Utah. I've been here my whole life. I absolutely love it here. And I am biracial. My father is Black and my mother is white. And so I've been I have different viewpoints on different sides and a lot of different experiences. Really, the reason why I decided to lean into this was it was about a week or two after the protests started in response to George Floyd's death, and I had a friend reach out to me and say, have you experienced racism in your life here in Utah? And my gut instinct and what I ended up doing was just downplaying all of my experiences and kind of shoving it off and being like, like I've experienced a couple of things here and there growing up, but definitely nothing like anyone else. And later that night, I was just tossing and turning in bed and trying to process things. Because it's been a very emotional time for everyone. And I thought to myself, why did I immediately downplay and discount my experiences that I have gone through ever since being a little girl up through an adult? And part of it, I think, was because I didn't realize how many of those, many of them were microaggressions. There have been a couple really overt ones that have definitely hurt me in the past. But looking for myself is that I've used that as a defense mechanism and a coping mechanism all these years. And I had a friend who came to me and was being very open, because I'm sure it was scary for her to ask that question. And I was not vulnerable myself. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to write down some of my experiences. I'm going to be open and vulnerable and have this conversation with her so that we both can learn. And I also think, being a mother of 2 small children, that it's really important that I model this behavior for them, that to have these to get comfortable in these uncomfortable discussions, so that they know how to react, an awareness and a critical thinking of these issues. So that's why I decided to lean into this conversation and do this, even though it's definitely uncomfortable, to help be a good model for my kids and for other people in my community. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, thank you. We so appreciate your participation. Laura, let's go ahead and turn it back over to you.
I just wanted to say that, Sean, I believe you hit the nail on the head when you said about the adversary relationship and the connection with people. And what I think is what Ken and his fellow, soldiers in blue, is that it's that connection with people that is going to be really difficult for them, and trying to regain that trust again in society, because right now it is so hostile. It's going to be very, very difficult for people to trust them. And my neighbors, I have several neighbors that are officers, and they're great guys, but overall, what you see on the news, sadly, there's a stigma now. And so now racism and discrimination is not only just to people of color, it's also going to be people of uniform. And so now you have officers who are good guys that sadly are going to have this, the stigma of just a few that have done some awful things. Now don't have the trust of us civilians. So, Ken, that's a real issue that that you're facing.
It is an issue, and it manifests itself in a number of ways, not the least of which is that we've had a few officers leave. I had a really great officer leave a couple of weeks ago who said, look, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to be a professional enemy, and I'm not comfortable, and I'm skilled, and I can go do other things. And we also are not attracting as many wonderful people. But I can't remember whether it was you, Lori, yesterday, or Vanessa. I don't remember who, but one person in the conversation yesterday said it is difficult to hate close up.
Yeah.
And I think that was you, Vanessa, that said that. And that's part of the reason that I'm willing to have these conversations, and I'm willing to have very direct and very uncomfortable conversations is because the more people get to see that we do have police officers that are very concerned about fairness and justice. And in my case, I just don't think we're getting anywhere until we can start introducing this word love into the conversation. I just finished over the last weekend a book called Letters to a Hindu. And it's the correspondence between Leo Tolstoy and Mahatma Gandhi from over 100 years ago. And Tolstoy makes this point over and over again in looking at the racial inequity in India, that until people arrive at a point of pursuing one another's needs because of love, there won't be any real progress. Now that, James, that is pie in the sky, James. That's real pie in the sky, but that's where I'm headed. And these conversations, this experience today, this starts to lay that foundation where we can move from tolerance to respect to affection to a deep and profound love for individuals.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing that up, because when we start to make this more personal, it makes me think about something, Sean, a conversation you actually had with my wife. And it was about having conversations, real conversations with our kids. And that impacted her greatly. Will you please talk about what that could look like? Because we've got a lot of viewers here that are probably a lot like me, and have kids and have lived in Utah or have not had as many interactions with people of color. Will you maybe walk us down? And then I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel here. How can we start to talk to our kids in an appropriate way about race?
It's very simple, but yet again, it's very difficult. Our kids are blank slates, and we have an opportunity to influence them in allowing and disallowing information for them to disseminate. I think it's really critical that we are honest with our kids, because especially at a very young age, kids are very honest with us. And the information that we give them needs to include the understanding of our connection as human beings. And if we do that in a way that also includes, to a certain degree, some of the negative things that exist, but understanding those foundations of why those negativities exist, we can start to convey the message to the children in a way that they can understand. We want to also convey messages to them that they can't turn around, because, kids by nature try to look for weaknesses in others as they're learning to navigate the world and to go through that so-called pecking order. We need to make sure that we have checks along the way as we educate them, so that they don't make those mistakes by taking a wrong turn in their interactions with people that they run into that don't look like them. I tell a story of being at a baseball game in West Jordan. Chief, you weren't around there, but I'm sitting behind a mother and her son. He must have been about 3 years old, and he kept staring at me. And this is, baseball games, even though they're 10-year-old baseball game, is still a lot of time. And eventually, he couldn't take his eyes off of me, and he asked me this question. He says, "Are you a chocolate man?" And I could see his mother just like going through, oh no, she wouldn't turn around. She didn't want to say a word, but I saw the sincerity in his question. And I thought immediately about adults not having that same curiosity to talk to people about race or anything else. And my answer to him was, why, of course I am, because I knew his frame of reference wouldn't be able to understand, everything that he was asking in that question. If I tried to explain it to a 3-year-old, he'd have got bored after 2 or 3 words and went on his merry way. But I also used it as a teaching moment for my kids who were there at the game with me at the same time. And I told them, I said, look at the difference between an honest, curious question about something and what it would have been like if an adult had asked me that question. And it's kind of a roundabout way to explaining that, this vulnerability that our children have and the opportunity we have to teach them, if we do it in the right way, we can at least ameliorate a lot of the issues that we have when we become adults in the way that we connect and talk to other people, so that our kids grow up, they have an understanding of what race is to a certain point. They have an understanding of what authority is when they're dealing with law enforcement to a certain point. But I think it has to be continuous in what we're talking to them about. We cannot sugarcoat things, because they know when we're sugarcoating things, and you also create dangerous environments if you sugarcoat some things to where kids don't fully understand it. And it's a hard process, but we have to talk to them about it. We cannot say, oh, this is too much for my kid, because they're going to catch on to something that's going on around them. They feel their environments and they're curious about them. And it's our responsibility to teach them the right way.
Thank you. Laura, go ahead.
You can actually start teaching your children about racism as young as 3 months. And there's lots of great resources out there, and websites and books. And it just goes to prove that they're never too young to start teaching. And it's not even about tolerance, because tolerance is too difficult of a word for them at 3 months. But it is, the word love has been thrown out there, but it's love and acceptance and understanding that differences in people is beautiful, and you can teach that at 3 months old. And it's if you can ingrain that at that young of an age, it becomes a fabric of them and just their code, and they will grow up understanding that there is nothing. Race doesn't mean anything, because we all bleed the same color.
Yeah, and Laura, you came from LA to Utah, and so there was probably, I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit to that, on how can we here in Utah do a better job of from just within our families or within our own circle of influence, of not making it feel maybe the way that it felt when you moved here.
I think a big thing is asking ourselves, like, what do I need to do to be open and honest about racism? And it does take some self-reflection. And sometimes what we see in the mirror is not going to be something we like. And we need to really see what our shortcomings are when it is about racism. We may not understand that what's been ingrained in us is not a good thing, and we need to change that. Sometimes we say some very you might think it's something very innocuous, and it's a very insensitive thing that we say to one another, even to our closest friends, and we don't realize that it is racist, what we just said. And we just have to do some more self-reflecting and some more be more self-aware of how we act with one another. Like I said, there were some things I have never, I'm not afraid to say that I'm 46 years old, soon to be 47. And I have never in my life been told, in the short amount of time that I've lived in Utah, 3 years, that it's pointed out to me time and time again that I'm not white. And why? I don't understand why that needs to be pointed out in Utah. Is it that big of a deal? And so it doesn't make a difference in my profession whether I'm white or not white. And so then I start to think, did someone say that to me as an insult? What was it meant to be cutting? Sometimes it said like, oh, you've done so much for someone who's not white. That's not necessarily a compliment. So it really does start with oneself. It's maybe our parents didn't mean to raise us the way they did, but they have. And so as adults, we need to take responsibility and just do some self-reflecting and try to reach out to the resources out there to, educate ourselves and become better people, and then educate our children and talk to our friends and, admit that maybe we've made mistakes and we're trying to, make the changes we need to eradicate racism.
Laura, I want to touch on what you stated about people approaching you and and asking you questions about race, sometimes people, they really don't know how to approach people, and other times they are true microaggressions. But people need to realize is I get questioned all the time of what brought you here to Utah. You know, like I'm not supposed to be here, being a black man in Utah, unless there was a draw. And I came here via lure of college, but they don't want to go into that. They want to find out why the black man is here in Utah. People need to find a way to be courageous in asking the questions they truly want an answer to, not trying to beat around the bush, not trying to, and not ending up saying something derogatory or offensive by not being real and authentic in the questions they're asking. You know, me being a person of color, I want people to be curious about me and my experiences so that I can share to help them grow. But if you're fearful of knowing the answer, you come up with all these different scenarios and ways to approach people, which may not be right. And then when we correct them, they go into this feeling of shame, and they don't ever ask anybody else a question. So it behooves us to be, you know, behooves people to be careful about asking questions in a certain way. We don't mean to shame you, but it's our right also to correct you. And a lot of times in our society, people don't get that. They might not get that from you because, like you're saying, you're going, well, why are you asking me this question? And me, I'm kind of bold enough to say, is this what you want to, is this the question you want to ask me? Or you want to ask this in a different way? And it kind of puts them on the spot, but it also allows people, if they're authentic and genuine, to really rephrase that question with my assistance. But we run into it all the time. And I think a lot of it is genuine curiosity, but just not knowing how to communicate with people, which is a shame because we all should be communicated to in the same way. There are some different codes and different language that we use as in our own cultures, but if you approach people honestly and authentically, you're going to get the answers that you want, but be willing to accept the answers that you get too.
Yeah, and that brings me to you, Vanessa. You had mentioned you grew up here in Utah. You've got a couple of kids. Maybe speak a little bit about what your experience was like, and maybe even, you know, did your parents have certain conversations with you? Have you had those with your kids? Like, what would you share with maybe another parent that's your age in the same situation here in Utah?
Yeah, so I will first speak to the stance I've chosen to take with my children. And I just think back to one of the most uncomfortable race conversations that I've ever had. Occurred 2 nights ago when I just barely got in the mail a book called Anti-Racist Baby. It's by Ibram Kendi. He has, he's like on the New York Times bestseller list right now for his adult version of this kid's book that he just wrote called How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's super educational, informative, enlightening. I think everyone should read it. It's wonderful. Anyway, so he just came out with a pared down, simplified board book version of this for children so that you can have conversations with your children. And so my husband and I sat down with my 5-year-old daughter and we went through this book. And I felt my heart rate like quickening, like I was like feeling like I was starting to sweat in certain parts. You know, I was worried about what she was going to think. And oh my goodness, now I've introduced race. And it felt like every time I said race or the word racist or racism would come up in the book, that it was just something like a bad word. And I thought, oh my goodness, discussing race and racism should not be a bad thing, right? Like, having these conversations with my daughter so that she's able to recognize and identify now, because even just because we don't have these conversations with our kids and we say, we'll deal with it when we're older, you're too young to understand this. Kind of like the idea that if I start talking about race and racism, that it's going to put these ideas in their head and they're going to behave that way. They're still going to get these messages when you're not around, through books that they read, through characters that they see on television, because it's so ingrained in our society. So it was really, it was hard and uncomfortable, but it was really great to sit down and have that conversation. with my daughter. And then the next day, she went and got the book again and brought it to me and wanted to read it again because she had more questions. And I'm sure it will grow, and we'll go back to that book many times. But yeah, it is uncomfortable, but I think it's so important that it starts young so that it's not negative, and so that they can identify when they see that something's not right or something's not portrayed equally, that they're able to call it out. It's kind of like, I feel like it's kind of like when you teach your young child about stranger danger and being able to identify dangerous situations. Does that mean that they're ever going to encounter one, or that it's that, you know, the time that's going to happen is maybe tomorrow? No, but it's better to have those conversations beforehand than after a situation happens. And I think that's the same thing with talking about race or any sort of social equality issues, so that they can understand how the world is framed. And when they see something, or they're taught something, or their friend says something, that they're able to say, that's not right. And instead of, you know, growing up in this sugar-coated world, and then we get to the point where we're adults, and it's like the blinders come off, and it's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that these things were happening, or that I could have been causing pain to someone else by what I said. So that's kind of how I have chosen to take the approach with my children. And my mother, she did a good job of doing it with us. She took us to a lot of different cultural festivals, and tried to take us to a lot of different experiences of a lot of different cultures as much as she could here in Utah as we were growing up, so that we were comfortable around a lot of different races and religions. And so I really have to hand it to my mother for doing that. I think that really helped shape who I am as well.
Yeah, and that leads me to you, Ken, because I'm curious, as it relates to our kids, what kind of programs have you implemented, are you implementing, or have you talked about in integrating some of these conversations with what you're doing with the police department and with even our schools? Is there anything of that that's been initiated, both for maybe educating kids on what the police are supposed to do and what they do, and as it relates to race?
Sure. But first, I want to just shout out to Vanessa, because that is a great book. And if you'll be patient, you'll see that on our West Jordan Police Department Facebook page. One of the things that we've done with kids is to spend time in small groups with kids. The impact of the COVID situation, the lockdown has been most distressing to me, is that I miss my Wednesday mornings at 11 o'clock at the West Jordan Library, sitting on a tiny little stool that I almost have somebody help me out of, reading books to kids at story hour. I absolutely love the prerogative of being chief of police and being able to have an hour with kids once a week, and being able to select books where we can talk about diversity in our society and introduce kids to, and often it has to do both with race and gender, and also bullying. We've introduced a couple of programs through our DARE officers in our elementary schools that deal with bullying. And of course, when we talk about racism at that age, it often is tied to acts of bullying. And if you want to share stories with your kids, I will just say, take a look at the West Jordan Police Department Facebook page. The last story we had posted up there is Rosa, the biography of Rosa Parks. I had the opportunity to work in person with Ms. Parks early in my career when I was working as an attorney, and visited a number of sites. And the last story we have up there is her biography. So, far less so than the adults, but yeah, we're engaging with kids primarily in the schoolrooms, primarily in the classrooms, and primarily through our DARE officers.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just take a moment and speak to our audience. Do you have some questions specifically that you'd like to pose to this panel? We're going to continue on here for the next 10 minutes. Then we'll have a quick little closing, but then we're going to stick around to answer some of those. So if you've got some questions, that have been bubbling up for you. We want to hear from you. But let's continue on. Laura, it seemed like you may have had another comment that you wanted to bring to the discussion.
No, I didn't have one.
Okay. So let's maybe go to one of the questions that Laura had posed a little bit earlier. And this is going to be back to you, Ken, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel. And she shares, in my subset of education, we often talk about needing to find the balance of authority of the educator with the empowerment of the students through a shared power approach. I wonder if police and other enforcement agencies are talking about this same concept. The enforcers need to maintain authority, but can they do so while taking a more mentoring and empowerment of the people mindset?
Oh, Laura, I wish you'd been sitting in my office about 3 hours ago when I had a conversation with one of our developing and implementing an outward mindset instructors, because we talked specifically about what we don't control. You know, we're taught from a very early age that we control all sort of things that we really don't. We don't control much external to our own thoughts. So the clear answer to that question is yes. We are helping officers understand through the focus on you matter like I matter, that we've got to surrender some of this control that we never really had in the first place. And the more latitude we allow for people to dialogue and discuss with us, sometimes even in a very aggressive way, the more we get to the point that we don't have to worry about what we control. You know, one of the catchphrases that you'll hear in training, in defensive tactics training, is, why do you care what they say when they do what ultimately you need them to do? And that is in no small part about allowing the other person some freedom, some space to express their frustration. Look, I get it. Laura, you may have some cops that are neighbors that are great guys, but you may also have had a very negative experience with a police officer. And how often do you get to interact with a police officer? I may be the next officer that you see, and so I've got to have the humility to take some heat, if you will, from your last experience. And we're trying to teach officers to allow people space to exercise their autonomy, to exercise what they think they control in our encounters, ultimately leading us to peace.
Sean, I know that you share some of these same beliefs. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think the chief touched on something that's really important, is the repercussions that sometimes officers receive from others based on past experiences. I've had negative experiences with law enforcement, but again, the thing that I think is really important is this connection and understanding that, you know, one person is not the same as the whole, or vice versa. We're all different individuals, and we have to be willing as people too to say, you know, this is not the same experience that I had at that point in time. It's hard to divide and separate our experiences from, you know, the occurrences that are happening currently in our lives, but we have to be critical. We have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, one thing is not always like another. I'll tell everybody that's on this call, and the chief can verify for me, and it's a hard thing for people to really pay attention to because they don't really think about this. But the chiefs of police here in Utah have the same feelings about the bad cops that we're experiencing out there in our community. And they're subjected to the hiring of people based on the information that they get when that person is hired. But when that person is on the job, just like all of us that are employers, they may not be that same person when they hit the streets. Our people that we hire may not be the same person once they hit the office or once they hit the field in which we've hired them for. And sometimes we can't vet them out soon enough until something happens. The bad thing about law enforcement is when something happens, it's usually really intense and it's a really bad situation. But they're really working hard to set up parameters to have a greater way of vetting these people before they actually hit the street. And I think that that's really important. I just wanted to sidetrack a little bit. I think that's really important for people to learn and know. And there again, that comes into that understanding of what activities are taking place by our law enforcement. I'm a true believer that we can all figure this out if we just have or take the time to do these things like we're doing now. I'd rather be doing these things in person because that makes all the difference in the world. But until we get over our current situation, that's going to be difficult. Another thing that is caused by this current situation we're in with COVID is we have captive audiences now that are getting inundated with information, both positive and negative. And we have to count on people to be able to navigate this new space that we're in and this new environment, to be able to disseminate the information that's correct or incorrect. And it gives a platform to people that are creating animosities and dissension, but it also gives us an opportunity to do things like this, to let people know that there are those out there like ourselves that are trying to bridge our communities. This is real critical because there's no telling how long we're going to be in this situation. So we have to now learn a new way of communicating effectively. And we're going to go through these growing pains for a little while here, but it's important that we include everybody, from our children, from ourselves to those that we have influence over, so that we can come to an understanding that this is also a great time for us to grow interpersonally, because we're not able to get out and communicate the way that we used to. And that personal growth is what's going to help us to evoke change within ourselves and our environment. I sidetracked, but I just had to get that off my chest.
Yeah, but that kind of takes us over to Laura and Vanessa specifically. I want to hear your perspective, and then turn it over to Ken again. There's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, getting rid of the unions. What are your thoughts about that? What is your perspective, Laura, about those conversations?
I think that we still need our police officers. So I don't think it's a matter of defunding our police. I think that, I think everybody's in a cloud of anger right now. I think, rightfully so. There have been some things that probably weren't handled correctly, could have been handled a lot better. Defunding the police is probably not exactly the thing to do. Perhaps we need to look at where funds can go to better places, but the same people that are calling out to defund the police, if they were in an emergency, the first people they're going to call are the police. So I was having this discussion with friends last night about this very same thing. We definitely need to come together and partner with the police and work better. And it's going to take a lot of communication. It's like what Sean just said. There are some growing pains. We're going to be in the midst of growing pains for quite a while. But we need to come to the table with cooler heads. And even if we differ in opinions, we need to be open to listening to each other's opinions first, and then be able to come together and see how we can work and work best, and not be angry just because we differ in opinions.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And before you answer and share your perspective, Vanessa, I want to just go back to our audience and let you know, we know that many of you have to run. We're coming up on the hour. This is being recorded, so you'll have access to that. But we understand that some of you need to take that break. So we're going to let you do that now before we move on. We're going to be moving into a Q&A here and more discussion in just a moment. But Vanessa, share with us your perspective about police and unions and defunding. I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think when I hear the term defunding the police, and I have been having some conversations with people, I think it's really important, as with when you're discussing anything that's controversial, or is to really have both parties define what that means for them. Because I think when I hear the term defunding the police, it encompasses a wide range of school of thought. from one extreme to the other. And so I think that's really important when you're having these conversations with people. So I guess that would be my first question is like, what exactly do you mean by defunding? Through the limited education and like learning that I have, I think that there is some merit to, and I wish they wouldn't call it defunding, but like reallocating or like shifting some of the responsibilities and things that we expect our police officers to do over to people that are maybe better equipped, like when it comes to mental health and like some of the social like things that social workers could do and those types of things, so our police officers are not so inundated with so many different things that they have to be guardians for, and have them be able to really focus on the things that we know that they can do best. So that's kind of my take on it, and how like some of the conversations I've had with people. I personally have had great experiences with police officers. I know that that's not everyone's experience is different. I think back to a couple years ago when we had a really scary domestic abuse situation with some of my close family members. And I felt great comfort in knowing that I called the police and said, I'm scared for my family's safety, and knowing that they were patrolling up and down our street for a couple of days. Like, I wish that everyone was able to have that experience. So I think we have great men and women who are serving and being guardians and protectors of our society. And I know that there are some bad apples, and I think that there are things that we can look at. But ultimately, I think when we're having these conversations, that when you're having it with someone, you need to really hone in on the definition of what it is you're talking about before you jump in. So
Thanks, Vanessa. Well, let's turn it over to you, Ken. And one of the other questions that came about was about, do you think the police unions play a role in keeping bad apples in uniform? And so we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then talking about, all these conversations around reform and defunding.
Sure. First off, let me reiterate something that Sean said. No one at all is more distressed by a bad cop than a good cop or a good chief of police, because we recognize that the bad cop carries a huge brush with which we are all painted. If you want to talk about defunding the police, I'm happy to have that conversation, but it is a very complex conversation, and it needs to be accompanied by a conversation about de-obligating the police. People ask me, are you aware of any effective tools that we can use to reduce police shootings? And they're often surprised when I ask them in turn, are you aware of one of the most successful crime prevention programs we've ever had in the United States? Tell me what you think it is. And they come up with all kinds of ideas. Not once in that conversation has anyone ever given the correct answer. That's Head Start. If you take a look at the kids that were involved in Head Start in the 1960s and do a tracking of those kids later, you will find that kids that were given the opportunity for early childhood intervention are kids who are less involved in crime. So if you want to talk about defunding the police, let's talk about refunding necessary social services. If you want to talk about cutting police shootings, let's talk about the fact that approximately a third of the shootings across the United States of America involve persons who are in mental health crisis and had a prior diagnosis of some mental health ailment. So if you want to talk about defunding the police, let's talk about refunding the services that really need to serve our community. And that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. With respect to unions protecting the bad apples in the police environment, I think that's a much worse problem in some other states. Utah is what's known as a right to work state. There's no mandatory collective bargaining here. There are a couple of cities that have police unions that have collective bargaining. I have a union here in my police department. I meet with the union board monthly, met with them yesterday. I have recently terminated an officer for misconduct related to racial bias. And the union stayed silent. I don't think that that's a real critical issue here in Utah. We've got to have review processes. We've got to have due process, just like any other public employee. It's tough to fire a police officer. It's tough to fire a school teacher, but it can be done, and we do it when it's appropriate.
Thank you. One last call out there. If there's any more questions that you want to pose, that you want to ask our panel, and I'm going to ask one as we're waiting for anyone else to chime in on here. And this is to you, Vanessa. One of the things that you had mentioned the other day was, people talking about how tired they are about all of this, and we need to take a break, or stop with some of these discussions. What would you say to that?
Oh, this is really hard. I'm curious to see what everyone else has to say as well. My initial thoughts are, this is emotionally draining. It's really hard. Self-care is important, right? Like, there are times that I need to take a step back. I need to refresh. I completely get that. I think the difference is that I think for some people, turning away with not the intention to turn back. And that's what scares me. And I think because we need to keep coming back and having these difficult conversations and continue to educate ourselves and continue to push through, because through struggle comes change. And so when I hear people say, I just can't take this anymore, and I need to I'm just going to take a break from everything. I just really urge them to take a break. Don't permanently take a break. Just think about how when you're able to take a break and turn off your social media, you're able to flip away from the news channel, you're able to, get off of Facebook or whatever is emotionally draining for you about this conversation. Recognize that there are some people that can do all of those things and it still doesn't matter, because it's their life and they're living in it 24/7. And that is, recognize that that's a privilege that you have. And so you need to, when you're ready, come back and continue pushing forward. It's hard and it's difficult, but it's necessary. So I'm curious to see what everyone else has to think about this, because it's been a real struggle with me. I've been hearing it a lot lately.
Yeah, Laura, why don't you go ahead? I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Sorry, I lost my audio for a second.
So I said we'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on this, on people talking about taking a break, or they're tired of all the negativity and wanting to just turn it off.
I have to concur with what Vanessa said. It does get exhausting, and it's important to step away, but not step away permanently. There are times where I get so angry at the TV, I start to shake my fist at it because of what's going on. And, but at night I do have to turn it off, because I find it that I start to carry it with me day in and day out. And then I feel it start to mold my personality into someone I'm not. And I want to remain a kind person, the person that I was raised to be, and not an angry person. Because I think when you're angry, that's when you make decisions and actions that, are not good. So I want to make sure that I represent someone who I want to be, someone who is kind, is accepting, is willing to listen to the differences, is willing to listen to someone that might be spewing hate. I want to know why they're spewing hate. I want to know why that person is the way they are. So it is important to step away from it, but then also, come back and see how you can be proactive and be an example of loving and kindness, and showing loving kindness to officers as well. It does pain me to see that, though our protectors are being shown a lot of hate out there right now, again, just because of a few bad apples. And so we need to definitely change the way perception is out there for everyone.
Yeah, Ken, and I can only imagine when we bring up this topic of all the negativity and trying to take a break, what is your perspective as a leader in law enforcement, especially with some of your officers? Because I would assume that many of them are going, gosh, I wish that we didn't have to continue in the atmosphere that we're in right now.
Well, Vanessa's right. Self-care is pretty critical, and there's my self-care evidence. The tan line of a motorcycle ride from last weekend, and it's for me personally, it's about balance and perspective. But frankly, in this position, I don't get a lot of choice about taking a break from the controversy that we're all experiencing right now. But I really have faith that we can turn this situation of adversity into advantage. I believe that all of us, I know that I am blessed with the innate ability to turn poison into medicine. I believe that we are making progress. That is very affirming to me. I believe that, I mentioned we've been cops in my family 151 years. It's not tradition. I just believe I'm called to serve in this capacity. And yeah, I'm tired right now. I've been tired for a number of weeks, a couple of months. I'm very tired. And I hear from some of my friends in law enforcement, particularly police chiefs, they're very tired. But we are also very hopeful. I am very, very hopeful, and that lifts my spirit up. This conversation today, getting to know some of my fellow panelists, lifts my spirit up. And as I said at the beginning, the difficult conversation that I had yesterday with the black officer in my agency that I've known for 25 years and never had the vulnerability or the courage to engage about race with that officer, the outcome left me with a high that's it's gonna stick for a long time, and it will carry me into the next hard conversation, so that I have faith that the next hard conversation ultimately will bring us to a better place.
So with that, I want to just hear some of your closing thoughts. Laura, if there's one other thing that maybe we haven't covered or something you'd like to share with our audience and for those who will listen into the recorded session, what would you like them to know more than anything here in our current environment?
I just like them to just be, and not be reactive to things, to just be responsive. And that just means take a second to really take a second to just digest what's going on first and really get all of the information, not just see things with, just blinders. You really need to look at all of the information to make a decision on things first and to form an opinion. I just don't think everybody has all of the information before they just jump into the herd mentality. And that's dangerous. That's a very, very dangerous to act these days. And it's frightening, I have to say when I first saw Ken, on the panel and I didn't know him, I was like, oh no, he's going to be an angry police officer. And he's far from that. And that's sad to say because of, some of what's being fed into the media. And so even, someone who like I said, I try to be kind, I try to be open-minded and try to be accepting of everyone. But even I'm not, I can't say that I don't have like some of the negative media also, in the back of my mind of like how officers are being seen. And I'm happy to say that Ken is far from that. He's very well educated and is, seems like the happiest, grandfather cop, ever. I'd love to get to know Ken a lot more and, and get his thoughts on other things. So it's just, it just goes to show we just definitely need to have all of the information before we jump into the herd mentality.
Yeah. How about you, Vanessa? Thank you, Laura.
I would say my final thoughts are that, and I'm learning this too, it's a learning process for me because I've shied away from this my whole life, is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's through those uncomfortable, tough situations when you're tired, when you're worn out, when it's a struggle, is when change and progress happens. I know at least the way I was raised, and I've taken it with me up until this point, is that which is good to be kind and nice, but that to shy away from anything that's uncomfortable, to avoid conflict at all costs. And I think it's led us to a place where it's easier for us to then keep people at a distance because we're not able to let our guard down and to be vulnerable and to get uncomfortable and get up close so that we can really learn about people. Kind of like what Ken was saying that he reiterated that I said yesterday, which is that it's hard to hate people from up close. And one of the ways we do that is by embracing being uncomfortable and getting vulnerable.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Ken, before you make some final comments, I just want to mention something Barbara had said about, rather than maybe looking at this as taking breaks, we look at it as a way of life, that we embrace this as a new way of life, of having these conversations on a more regular basis. But with that, why don't you close us out, Ken, with some of your parting thoughts?
Well, my first parting thought is that, Vanessa, your two kids would love my grandkids, and I look forward to a day that for me, grandkids, right? Because my grandkids are older than your kids, but again, when they look back and say, our parents, my granddaddy, he did something to bring peace. Laura, my business is conflict. For 40 years, every day of my professional life, it's been about some conflict that somebody else brought to my doorstep. And if that has taught me anything at all, it is the incomparable value of the pursuit of peace. And that's really what we're about here today. And in my language, in my view as an old cop, it's about pursuing loving one another and bringing peace. And so my closing thought to everybody here is that I wish a blessing of peace upon you, and I commit again here today as a cop and as a grandfather to pursue peace in our community.
Well, thank you all, and another big thank you to Sean for joining the panel, and thank you all out there that attended today. If you found value in this, we invite you to please share this with your friends, with your family, with the people that are in your life that matter to you, because these conversations matter, and we're all going to face it together, whether we like it or not. So let's do a better job at coming together and make this personal. Please make it personal. With that, everyone, until next time, stay connected. Bye-bye.